This isn't the first time Dick has given a talk in the Mitchell Center. In fact, he was one of the earliest speakers here, at least from when I arrived. And that's because even though we were, on the one hand, on a route to go try to get a whole bunch of funding from the National Science Foundation to support what the National Science Foundation supports, science and engineering and math and technology, on sustainability issues, we also, for the fall of 2008, invited a wonderful speaker to be the Mitchell lecturer that year, Mary Evelyn Tucker, who's one of the world's leading theologians who I think can take partial credit for the Pope's encyclical this last year, on some of the sustainability challenges facing humanity. So she came in that fall when she was here. We organized a whole series of talks on the moral, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of sustainability, or maybe environmental issues. I can't remember how we framed it, but Dick gave a wonderful talk way back then, as did several other really amazing speakers. And what, for me personally, this has always been kind of, how do we benefit from the breadth of expertise and perspectives that exist in a university like this, where maybe the NSF view is there's part of the university that they support, but the humanities and the arts are so important to how we understand how we got to this point in time and what we're going to do. What are our obligations as citizens and inhabitants of this planet for where we're going to end up. And so this is yet another opportunity to hear from folks in the humanities about their work and how it informs our collective thinking, our collective responsibilities. So it's, and it isn't just for me exciting to hear Dick talk. One of the first books I read when I was coming to Maine was this wonderful one that he and his co-author wrote called Natural States, which was really looking at how environmental thinking works in Maine and Oregon, and then sort of thinking about it in the nation as a whole. And his most recent book that he's going to talk about today, Second Nature. And before I mentioned that something about a coupled natural human system, that's how NSF views the world. They talk about nature and natural systems and human systems. That's what Second Nature is all about, and particularly if you focus on the last chapter, which I've read several times now, there's so much powerful thinking in here that it's almost, even though it ends up talking about the same things NSF researchers talk about in such a different way, that if we could only bring those two ways of thinking together, I think we'd be unstoppable. So I also want to say a couple other things about Dick. He don't know how he managed to do this, but he did his PhD at UC Irvine, not exactly like this part of Maine, but here he is. And I'm from California also, so I'm glad that he survived that experience. He was one of the principal architects, working with a lot of his colleagues, on this emerging area in the Northeastern Americas, this humanities research and education program, and I continue to believe that we can find synergies between the work that many of you do linked to the Mitchell Center and that exciting effort. And I just want to say that I had Linda Silka, who's a senior fellow here, and I had the opportunity to meet with Dick recently, and two relatively new colleagues in history, Ann Knowles, who's in the digital humanities, and Mark McLaughlin, who's an environmental historian himself, working on a lot of Canadian environmental issues, including, of all things, the history of the spruce budworm, which you'd think, oh, that's ancient history, except that, of course, it's right coming back again, so fasten your seatbelt. So maybe that's the point, is that things we think about from a historical frame, that it's not just looking in the rearview mirror. There's a lot of it that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. One last comment before I turn this over to Dick. This isn't even the only history talk this spring. On April 18th, a very different kind of a talk, a former graduate of the University of Maine, Jerry Wright, who did his degree in forestry, one of the world's leading experts, I think, on Frederick Law Olmsted, who at least did some designs for this university, although I'm not sure they were operationalized. His sons helped design part of the campus. He designed Central Park and was very involved in Yosemite. He'll be here, and I think as part of that, he'll do part of his one-man show about Frederick Law Olmsted. So that's a real treat on a Monday, April 18th. Kind of cut into Dick's time, but thanks, Dick. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, David, for that very nice introduction. I was thinking when you were talking about my past experience here, this is one of the few times I've talked to a mixed audience of academics. I'm used to talking to a popular audience, and I'm used to talking to historians, but not so much mixed academics. So I'm a little nervous about what questions this is going to generate, but nevertheless, we'll give it a go. I've been working for about 15 years, I think, on this very nebulous question of the environmental movement, or for purposes of being here at the Mitchell Center, the sustainability movement, I guess we'll call it. But it's a very, as you probably know, a very important part of the development of the 20th century reform effort in the United States. It's one of the most popular reform movements we have ever had in this country, and it's certainly the most sustained reform movement we've ever produced in this country. And in a sense, what I was interested in is how this came about in the years after World War II, why it happened at this particular time, and what is its essential characteristics. And as a result of that research, as David said, I put together, this is, again, one of the most grassroots reform movements in American history. As you see here, in reaching its climax in the late 1960s or so, or mid-1970s, I guess this is. But about 10 years ago, we decided, Chris Beach and I, when we were working on a book project on this, that we would try to put together some sense for how this movement took place by looking at two particular areas, Maine and Oregon. And in doing that, we came up with what we thought were some basic reasons for the development of the environmental movement. One being that throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the environment was on the front page of the newspapers almost continuously through these 2 decades, whether it was oil spills or water pollution, 3 Mile Island, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, these kinds of things. You just saw that environmental crisis after environmental crisis taking place. And that sort of explains the environmental movement. But the other thing that happened about the same time is we moved into a new phase of our consumer economy in America. If you want to look back, say, into the 1890s, what America was producing mainly was the goods we needed to survive, a roof over your head, food to eat, things like that. As we moved into the 1920s, we sort of shifted in our consumer economy into the production of conveniences, toasters, radios, things like that. And as we move further into the post-World War II period, we moved from the production of conveniences into the production of what we call the quality of life. That is what people were really interested in consuming, was quality of life. And this is not something you can go to the store and buy like you could a toaster or a radio. It's something that if you wanted to consume it, you had to become involved in politics. And for some historians, this is the way we explain the environmental movement, as just one more phase in the evolution of America's consumer equality, as we move from bread and butter issues into quality of life. To have quality of life, you need to get involved in community politics, state politics, and national politics. So this was sort of the overarching premise of our book. This is the book that we produced about 10 years ago, Chris Beach and I, called Natural States, the Environmental Imagination in Maine, Oregon, and the Nation. And as you can kind of see from the subtitle, Maine and Oregon serve as case studies in the environmental movement in the nation here. Now, when you do a case study, you can do it under one of two premises. The first premise is that it is so unique, Maine and Oregon, that it merits some kind of study. Or you can look at it as Maine and Oregon are so representative of everything else that's going on that it gives you some insight into the broader national environmental movement. And we chose the latter. That is, we decided that Maine and Oregon are good windows into looking at the environmental movement nationwide. So we chose three things to look at that are national crusades. One was water pollution on the Willamette River and on the Androscoggin River. The second was the politics of wild and scenic rivers on the Rogue River in Oregon and the Allagash in Maine. And then the third was land use regulation with the LERC and a comparable agency in Oregon as well. And these, we thought, really explained a lot about the environmental movement nationally. Okay, so this was somewhere around 10 years ago, and my thinking evolved between that time and when this book came out just 2 years ago, I think it was. And I began to think of New England not so much as a national representation, but a very unique place that had a very unique environmental movement. So my thinking that went on in this book, again, two things. And the first is that there is no environmental movement in America. There are environmental movements, regional movements that reflect the landscape visions that people have in each of those places. And then the second thing is that if you want to understand these environmental movements, you really have to begin with the landscape itself, because that's what people are interested in protecting. So with those two premises, that regions each have their own environmental movement, and you understand that movement by looking at the landscape itself, I put together this book here, which is an environmental history, basically, of New England from glacial retreat 12,000 years ago or so up to the present. But the last chapter is on the environmental movement in New England, which I argue is a very unique movement because of this term here, the idea of second nature. So I want to explain a little bit about what's unique in New England and how that relates to the environmental movement. All right, so what's unique about New England? What is it that the way we look at the environment here or the landscape here that's very different from any place else? My thinking is that in New England we have arguably the longest occupants, post-pioneering occupants of any place in the country. It might be the Spanish Southwest, might be a little older, but it really isn't as vital or vibrant as the occupants in New England. So we're looking at nearly 400 years of post-pioneering occupation of New England. And during those years, hundreds and thousands of writers commented on the regional consciousness of New England and made New England, in a sense, an iconic place in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about these in a minute. And then the second thing that I think is unique about New England is that our most cherished landscapes here are not so much those great nature icons that we have out west, say the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone Valley or something like that, but they are inhabited places. They are humanized places. Farms, villages, the New England Village, seacoast, ports, these kinds of things. Cape Cod, places that have been inhabited for those 4,000 years by Euro-Americans and have taken on a kind of an iconic quality to them. So what I was looking at then is basically this idea of second nature, that first nature is what we would consider wilderness, basically something that is pristine, untrammeled by man, as the Wilderness Act says. And what we're looking at in New England is second nature. That is a nature that is nebulous, hard to define, but somehow it has a salience that we all agree is worth preserving. That is, you could say, I think, that any nature, whether it's the most pristine place in the country, has some human qualities to it. And any totally humanized place has some natural qualities to it. So there's a continuum here of nature to artificial. And somewhere on that continuum, there's a sense of balance and place that people all agree is the essence of that particular region. There's a proper balance of nature and human improvements that we all agree somehow is worth preserving, whether it's a working forest, a village green, a centuries-old farm, or even a city neighborhood. That this becomes, in New England at least, the essence of the environmental movement. This is, I think, very distinctive of New England. It's not that no other place has second nature, but here it has such prominence, it has such salience, it becomes the focus of the environmental movement itself. So again, here's the Western version of the environmental movement. I think it's the Green River, but I can't remember exactly. And in this environmental movement, what we see is that there's a very strong separation between the cultural and the natural. That is, this is wild, Los Angeles is artificial, and the idea of the conservation or the environmental movement is to separate those two, to keep those two separate, to make sure there's a boundary between natural and artificial. In New England, again, we are talking about humanized, hybrid landscapes that are iconic and worth preserving. We're protecting a hybrid environment of farms, woodlands, cut-over forest, seaports. I'm just going to give you a quote here from Howard Mumford that kind of explains what I think is that seamless connection between nature and culture in New England. This is his description of a New England landscape. He says, "The moorland pastures by the sea, dark with bayberries and sweet fern breaking out among the lichened rocks, and the tidal rivers bringing their weedy tang to the low meadows wide and open in the sun, pine groves where the needles hum to the wind or knotted New England hills where the mountain laurel in June seems like upland snow, the fringe of sumac on the roadside, volcanoes of red and crimson, the yellow of September cornfield with pumpkins lying between the shadows." And again, there's sort of a seamlessness of nature and culture in these landscapes. Mountain laurel, sumac sort of representing disturbed landscapes, cornfields, and yet a lot of nature too. So it's this hybrid landscape that becomes part of the environmental movement in New England. Distinctive landscapes and distinctive environmental movements. All right, let me just take a few seconds to explain why these landscapes like this became so iconic, not only in New England, but for all of America. New England farms really represent ruralness for all Americans in some case. The saltwater farms, the upcountry hill farms, things like that. Really, when Americans think of rural areas, they think of this New England farm. And partly this goes back into the 1840s when landscape artists like Frederick Church and others moved into the White Mountains and made these landscapes, part of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, made these landscapes ironic so that all Americans could look at these and see this is the essence of the sublime in America, these White Mountain landscapes. And then in the 1880s, a couple of decades later, we find the tourist invasion of the White Mountains, and some of those same concepts, the idea of color and palette and perspective and symbolic representation that the landscape painters were dealing with, show up in guidebooks like this. This is Thomas Starr King's guidebooks to the White Hills, and he's talking about those same concepts, those same landscape appreciation concept, giving these tourists, people that are traveling in this area, a language in which to express their own interpretation of the landscape. I know in one of these books, it wasn't this one, it was a different one, but the author was hiking up in this area with a colonel from Kentucky, not the Kentucky colonel, but a Kentucky colonel anyway, and he was up in a place like this. And they're looking at this magnificent view of the of Mount Washington, standing on this bluff, and the colonel rears back and he says, "By Jove, this sure beats Kentucky." And that's not what Starr King or this other author wanted to hear. You know, there's this ritualized language that becomes part of these landscapes that people use if you're genteel enough to express yourself in places like this. Is the sublime. This is the sublime. So these become part of the tourist language of the 1880s and the 1890s, and basically this is the thing that makes these landscapes somewhat ironic. Just a couple other developments that happened about the same time, the 1880s, that sort of reinforce that notion of an iconic landscape in New England. This is a representation of the colonial revival, which begins in the 1890s and continues on to the 1930s. And it's a celebration of family life and furniture and architecture and all things colonial. It's basically urbanites, wealthy urbanites, sort of put off by the changing demography of their own cities, taking this nostalgic look at the New England landscape. So in this sense, the church on the green, those kinds of things, again, become very iconic during these periods because of this outpouring of literature on the colonial revival. The other thing that's happening about the same time is we get a number of authors, regional authors, writing books, regionalist literature. Probably the most representative, the most characteristic is Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Firs, which is about a small village, seaport village down in the southern part of Maine, in which she sort of encapsulates all the things that regionalist writers do. What they're trying to do is to present you with a kind of a folk hero, a folk, an idea of the folk, what folk means in America, set in a very natural environment. Something like this is Dunnett's Landing down on the coast of Maine. And the themes that run through Country of the Pointed Firs and all of this regional, New England regionalist literature are a sense of timelessness. These are places where nothing ever changes and nothing ever will change. Very reassuring again to those urban readers who are being besieged by new immigrants coming from Europe and from Asia and places like that. There is a sense of timelessness here that is very, very reassuring. They're very traditional. They're very organic. These are landscapes where trees and brush and grasslands and meadows sort of intersperse with the villages themselves. And they're also surprisingly stagnant places. They're places where the golden age has come and gone, it's over, and these are sort of the ruins of what life was like during that heroic period of seafaring and fishing and lumbering and all those things. And in that stagnant quality, you see this in the old people that are in, say, Country of the Pointed Firs or something like that. That stagnant quality has a sort of subtext to it, which is that the time when you really wrenched nature into some sort of cultural mode is over with. And nature is sort of relaxing, people are relaxing, buildings are becoming naturalized again, the pointed firs are sort of creeping into the village itself. So there's a kind of a harmony between nature and culture that you see in these regionalist writings that really reflects what becomes part of the environmental movement in New England. So regionalist writing, the colonial revival, the emergence of tourism in New England, going back to the Hudson River School, all these things, what's important here is all these things help to make the New England landscape, this hybrid landscape, iconic, something worth protecting in the same way that you would protect, say, Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or Yosemite. And that, again, is the sort of essence of the environmental movement in New England. All right, so Robert Frost, Sarah Orne Jewett, these people are making birch trees, bending birch trees, and roads not taken and things like that in New England, national icons in the period between, say, 1840 and 1950 or here. All right, so how does that play out then in terms of the environmental movement itself? One of the first major campaigns of the environmental movement in New England, as it was just about every place else, was water pollution control. And the reason for that, of course, is that our waters were in terrible condition. You could not cross, say, the Androscoggin River without absolutely becoming nauseated on the bridge. People talk about going halfway over the bridge, getting sick and having to come back. They were so polluted. These were places where dissolved oxygen was down to 3 and 4 parts per million, which doesn't sustain life at all. These were dead rivers. So the first major campaign is to put these rivers back to life, to reduce the amount of toxins and chemicals and fibers, wood fibers and cotton fibers that are going into these rivers, the raw sewage going into these rivers, and clean them up, which was pretty much done by the 1980s or so. This was one of the great achievements of the environmental movement here. And what you see is all these river cleanup committees for all these rivers, these industrialized, these stinking rivers in New England, very quickly transform themselves into watershed associations to protect the banks of those rivers, those very industrialized rivers, from overdevelopment with things like wetlands preservation, boating access, housing setbacks, green belts, conservation easements. All of these things become part of the environmental movement in New England, largely because these are, again, second nature landscapes. These are not pristine rivers in any sense of the word, and in a very important way, New England pioneers this idea of conserving industrialized rivers, or rivers that are at least humanized in some form or another. Same thing with the coast. 1971, Massachusetts pioneers the idea of coastal zone management commissions. Rhode Island does the same, 1975, I think it is. New Hampshire and Maine become involved in some terrific fights over oil tanker ports and refineries and things like that. And again, we're talking about here iconic humanized landscapes, not so much nature versus culture, but these second nature landscapes. So that's going on here. But our most important iconic landscapes are actually the rolling hills, the winding roads, the farms, the centuries-old farms, things like that, that are very, very difficult to preserve in the traditional ways that environmental activists are used to thinking about. They need things like land use zoning and stuff like that. This is in 1982. This is the period when the semiconductor revolution is exploding across the landscapes of New England, or southern New England at least. Subdivisions and suburbs are sort of moving out into the landscape. In 1982, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management published the first landscape inventory of not natural areas, but scenic areas that contained traditional architectural landscapes. Survey of the Commonwealth's scenic areas, and they included places like this is a picture from that survey. And what this did is outline what it thought were the most important scenic treasures of Massachusetts, which is not, the mountains or the forests, but landscapes like this, and then provided a whole list of zoning tools that could be used to preserve these: land use zoning, cluster development, woodland fringes, buffers, targeted purchases, easements, things like this. And what happened is that conservation commissioner, the zoning commissions in each of the towns used this as a template and developed their own body of zoning regulations to try and preserve places like this. And you don't really think of this much as an achievement of the environmental era, but it's really very important here. It's one of the great achievements in American land use history. To be able to preserve and stabilize places like this. So, in a way, this is New England's contribution to the environmental movement. In the same sense, the attempt to protect these landscapes, which are these farming landscapes, centuries old, 2 centuries old, sometimes 3 centuries old farms, that have been passed down from generation to generation. And again, these achieve iconic status because of the colonial revival, the country life movement. Teddy Roosevelt in the 1890s and 1910 period here attempt to revitalize country life in America. Back to the land surges in the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1960s, the whole back to the land movement. And then a kind of peculiar New England tradition of what we call rusticating, which is wealthy families from the cities, because they wanted to get out of the cities during the summertime because of the epidemic diseases and such, they would send their families up into the farms, the upcountry, their upcountry farms, to the wife and the kids would spend the summer then with this farm family, rusticating, basically doing a few farm chores and pretending that they're farmers. And the husband would come up when he had weekends off and things like that to stay with him. I love this picture because it's so, you can see the look on the, I don't know if you can or not, the look on that woman's face there. She is not looking forward to having these city folks with them. And here's a teenage girl. She is so not looking forward to spending the summer in some godforsaken town in Maine. But nevertheless, these are the things that make the farm so iconic in New England. And during this period, we begin to see the pioneering effort to preserve these farms through current use valuation. This is an idea that begins in Maine, or New England, begins in Connecticut in the 1960s, used first for forestry, and then farmers caught hold of this, and they began using current use valuation somewhere in about 1954 or 1955 in Connecticut, and it passes on down through some of these other places as well. Extension service getting into things that would support small-scale farming in these areas, and then the purchasing of development rights or conservation easements. So the state might buy up the development rights to this farm, which provides the farmer capital to keep in business, and provides the state with the assurance that this would never be turned into a series of condominiums or something like that. So again, these are all ideas that start here in New England. They're passed on through the rest of the nation later on, but this is one of the major contributions that New England makes to this region. Well, the major thing that connects New England environmentalism to environmentalism nationwide is the attempt to preserve uninhabited countryside or uninhabited places. And this also is an area in which New England pioneers some major efforts here. Begins here, let's say, with Percival P. Baxter. This is the person who, between the mid-1930s and the mid-1950s, began buying up parcels around Katahdin Park, Katahdin Mountain, and put together Baxter State Park. In the early 1950s. That's here in Maine. This is George E. Dorr, who orchestrated the purchases and the gifts of land that became Acadia National Monument, and a couple of years later, Acadia National Park here. These are private people getting involved in a conservation effort. And then Charles Eliot Jr. here, who in 1891 put together in Massachusetts the Trustees of Public Reservation, which is basically sort of a state-sanctioned land trust to accept gifts of land and to buy land, use money to buy land, and put together a whole series of public lands for the state of Massachusetts. This was such a good idea that Connecticut adopted it in 1895. And in 1901, the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests sort of follows on this same idea here. So here are private land trusts. Again, another idea that comes from New England and is distributed across the nation in the 1970s and 1980s, but preserving some of the great natural gems in New England in this period. This is the contemporary Kennebec Valley Land Trust, and you can see this is fairly typical of lands that are just kind of distributed. It's an opportunistic approach to land preservation. You buy up lands where they come on the market or where you have a good deal, or people donate lands to you. You can see they're kind of distributed all through the Kennebec Valley here. This is the Down East Lakes Land Trust. It's in the Machias and St. Croix region, eastern Maine, in this area here, coupled with some other land trust area here, a lot of preserved land in this area in here. And the thing about this is that these are also local. What's nice about them is they're also local, that you can design your trust any way you want. That is, if you want to preserve fish, migratory fish, which is what the Down East Land Trust is all about, you can design both access to and acquisitions of land to do exactly that. So you can tailor it to just about anything you want to do. Another great idea coming out of the New England environmental movement. This is the Down East Land Trust lands here. And then this idea grows, of course, the Nature Conservancy, which is founded in New York, but very quickly moves into Connecticut, becomes a New England idea. The Nature Conservancy in 1998, I think it was, acquired or got easements on about 220,000 acres up in the St. John watershed, this very remote region of northern Maine. One of the last really wilderness rivers east of the Mississippi, and preserve that. This is the Nature Conservancy lands, Down East Land Trust here. The Penry heirs put their lands in trust for sustainability, sustainable logging, and for conservation in this area here, so that between the Penry lands here and the Nature Conservancy land, you have about a fifth. Right there, 5/10, is that right? 5% of Maine. It's 1 million acres, 20 million. If I got the math right, yeah. Okay, this is somewhere around 1 million acres today, all in land trust. And again, this is basically an idea that was born here in Maine. In the 1980s, the state became involved, of course, in land acquisition as well. This is the Land for Maine Futures lands. Land for Maine Future was set up in 1987, I think it was, and has been acquiring land since then. This is one of the very, very beautiful Namaquana Lake region, 43,000 acres in there. Bigelow Preserve, which is about 35,000 over by the Sugarloaf area, 35,000 acres in there, and land all over the state. This is the Cutler Coast Reserve, also part of the Land for Maine Futures purchases, about 12,000 acres of cobble beaches, coastal forests, blueberry barrens, trails, campsites, things like that. So this is all part of what's become, I think, somewhere around over 10% of Maine is now in some sort of conservation easement or trust like this. And it really kind of brings up the question about how you manage what, for all intents and purposes, is a kind of a wilderness region today. That is, we have now, through the local land trusts, the Nature Conservancy, the other land trusts, about 10% of Maine held in easements. So the question is, how do we manage these uninhabited lands? And of course, the precedent for this is the 1964 Wilderness Act, right? This is the act that set aside lands in the national parks, the national forests, BLM lands, and some in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, set aside as untrammeled by man, as the act says, and to be dedicated for all time to wilderness management. This is the stipulation of the Wilderness Bill itself, and I'm not going to read all of this, but it sort of gives you an idea of how wilderness land should be managed. They're untrammeled by man, generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, outstanding opportunities for solitude, at least 5,000 acres, horizon to horizon wilderness, and may also contain ecological, geological, other features. To kind of simplify that, a true wilderness, by those standards, then, by the standards of the Wilderness Act itself, is that it has no human history, it's untrammeled by man, it is ecologically stable, it is the same way it was before contact, European contact. It is, again, horizon to horizon wilderness, and all of the pre-contact flora and fauna are intact. That's wilderness. All right, so Maine wilderness, all these 10% of Maine that we now manage for wilderness values, becomes kind of a problem. First of all, just to New England wilderness, these lands that we're talking about here, do have a human history, 200, 300, if you want to include Native American history, 2,000, 3,000 or 12,000 year history of use of these lands, which means that they come with all sorts of prior claims to these lands. Should we have them accessible by automobile? Should we have them accessible by snowmobile, ATVs? Should we allow hunting? Should we allow fishing? All these prior claims, 2 or 3 centuries of prior claims to these lands. It has to be sorted out in a way that you really wouldn't have to if you made wilderness by fiat out in the West someplace. So there's that complication, right? This is the Emigrant Pass Wilderness in the Sierra Nevada. It's probably about the same as it was in Native American times. I don't think it's changed that much because of the soil moisture, competition for soil moisture, the altitude, extreme weather conditions. Things just don't change that much. When we're looking at Maine, the wilderness here is an extremely dynamic wilderness ecology. It's an ecology that is rebounding from centuries of logging and fires and things like that, diseases that have swept through these areas. It is a naturally dynamic landscape. So how do you preserve, how do you manage something that is changing right under your feet? What sort of management policies? You know, with the Western wilderness, you basically say, all right, no cars, no mining, no forestry, and you leave it alone. You have to make some choices here about what kind of wilderness you actually want. Wilderness in Maine and the rest of New England is much more fragmented than it is out west. Most of the western wildernesses are in some federal designation, national park, national forest, national BLM lands or something like that. Here we have town wilderness, if you want to call it that, state wildernesses, federal lands, trusts, easements, and they're scattered all over the map, right? Which is not so bad in a sense. That means that it's had wider access to more people. You can go off and walk in the town forest, Vanguard Town Forest, or the Orono Trust lands. Everybody has access to it. So in that sense, it is more democratic, I think, than Wilderness Out West. And also it provides a much more intimate view of nature than those panoramic perspectives that you get, say, from the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or a place like that. Say you look at nature at a much different level than you would in these big wilderness areas. So fragmentation is not so bad in that sense. What makes it difficult, however, is that we also have in New England this very dynamic fauna. It's not only the woods and the rivers that are dynamic, but it's the creatures that live there as well. The reintroductions of beaver, fisher, turkey, Atlantic salmon, peregrine falcons, all sorts of species that are expanding into residential populations, deer, lynx, etc., migrations into the region by coyotes and opossums, with the ban on DDT, the rebounding of osprey, bald eagle, blue heron, all these coming back and providing a mix in the landscape, again, that is very difficult to manage under the wilderness, the guidelines of the Wilderness Act itself. So again, beaver rewilding these wilderness areas. Once you get a beaver dam in here, the ecology of the whole area and the flora and the fauna of the whole area around it changes. Frogs, turtles, herons, swallows, otters, mink, deer, moose, all these are affected, these populations are affected by this one keystone species here. So the wilderness that we're talking about here is not just a let-alone wilderness, it's a very dynamic wilderness. And that raises some questions about just how you manage a wilderness in New England as opposed to the types of lands that people were thinking about when they passed the Wilderness Act back in 1964. Can wilderness mean something other than a climax forest? Can a wilderness be smaller than the range of its top predators? Can non-native species be part of this wilderness? Coyotes. What prior uses can wilderness accommodate? Can reforestation in this wilderness, if you let these wilderness areas go. Many of the meadows will be closed in by forest. Can reforestation in the wilderness be allowed to threaten open ground species? These are the questions that we're faced with in that whole matrix of wilderness lands or preserved lands that we have here in New England. I'm just going to end by talking about maybe one, let me skip that. This is the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, which is, for us, more a precedent than the Wilderness Act for how you manage these lands. Because when this was put together, both the conservationists and the timberland owners that didn't want their lands flooded by the Dickey-Lincoln Dam were talking about what they called a working wilderness, which is a contradiction in terms. How can you have a working wilderness? But this kind of flexibility is what's really needed in the management of these particular lands here. That idea that you can have a humanized wilderness in some fashion or another. This is the falls at the Allagash Dam. You would think you're in a wilderness unless you walked, say, a quarter mile that way or that way. But nevertheless, this is what we manage here. Just to give another example here. This is the Long Lake Dam. It was built in 1911 by the St. John Lumber Company. It was a huge dam, held back a huge amount of water there. And this is part of the wilderness experience. You line around that with your canoe, not so much because it's a difficult rapids, but because there's spikes still sticking up from the timbers and the foundation there. So this is part of the wilderness experience here, not something you would expect if you were going by the guidelines of the 1964 Wilderness Act. So how do you manage this? I don't have any idea, but this is what people are sort of moving towards anyway. An Eastern Wilderness Management Plan that would involve multiple levels of management, some sort of coordination between local, state, federal, NGO, land trust, private owners, and public participants, stakeholders. Rather than one simple federal umbrella to manage these lands. And then within sort of overseeing that complex of stakeholders, some umbrella organizations, and some that have been around in the past are the Northern Forest Alliance, Forest Biodiversity Project, the Wildlands Reserve Networks, Vermont Biodiversity Project, New Hampshire Ecological Reserve System Project. And these are sort of, as it says, umbrella organizations that bring together these stakeholders and try to reach some sort of consensus on these difficult questions that I put up on the previous slide here. One pathway would be to identify the critical habitat in these areas, develop suitable management plans, whether this should be purchase, trust, or easement, map out large roadless areas, set those aside as core areas, and piece together a region-wide wildlife conservation program. What this means is identifying sort of core areas here where top predators and more vulnerable species, flora and fauna, would be protected here, and then have buffer zones around this where more tractable flora and fauna would be able to exist within some range of human use of these lands as well. So core areas and buffer zones here, core areas, buffer zones where plant and animal communities are more resistant to human influences. And then what some people are proposing are connectivity corridors. And these would be ways to get from one of these core areas to another core area to accommodate, say, territorial migrations, encourage some genetic diversity as animals move from place to, or plants move from place to place, and expand the range of the large carnivores. And probably the most ambitious of these projects is called the Algonquin to Adirondack Park Connectivity Zone, A to A, moving things like lynx and wolves, perhaps, from the really wild territory up here in the Algonquin Park in Ontario down into the Adirondack Park, and then maybe into northern New England as well. So these are some of the issues, some of the pioneering movements we have made here in New England, and that's pretty much where I'm going to leave this. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have.
historically, some of the cherished pieces of Maine were privately purchased.
Yes.
Was the controversy at the time, as is currently with the Quinby?
With the Baxter State Park, there actually was. I mean, not quite to the degree that there is today, but there was resistance in the state legislature to the gift of the Baxter gifts. I forget what exactly the issue was then. A lot of resistance to any sort of nationalizing of the area around. I mean, the park proposal has been around since at least the 1890s. And there's been this sort of anti-federalist theme that runs through this whole thing. So that's very current. I mean, that's very...
So is this different?
Hmm?
Is the controversy today different than it was then, just still more intense?
It's more intense, definitely, yeah. But that sense of anti-federalism, and I think some of the same issues. Will this curtail hunting? Will this curtail the use of timber for commercial products? Those kinds of things. Those issues have been around for an awful long time. So, it's more polarized, I think, than it ever has been. But certainly the issues are the same. Yes.
Can you comment on your the research that you've done in finding this concept of the pristine Maine wilderness, right? So it's like you talk about the Allagash, and
Right.
you can go up there and you think you're in this untouched wilderness, except for the fact you're there, and then you come across a locomotive that's on an island.
Right. Yeah. Where you hear chainsaws as you're going down the Allagash or
That's what I
skidders.
feel like, the way in which we manipulate that concept of pristine.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is very apparent in the whole controversy over the Allagash as a wilderness waterway. I don't know how familiar you are with the origins of the wilderness waterway, but there was a proposal for a gigantic dam. This would have been the largest dam east of the Mississippi to be built on the St. John River, and it would have flooded most of the St. John and at least half of the or quarter to a half of the Allagash. And introduced all sorts of new problems in that area. It was supposed to also be a major recreational site. They were going to put hotels and marinas and all sorts of things up there. It would have changed the whole complexion of northern Maine, really. And it was kind of a strange alliance of conservation, National Resources Defense Council, the National... NRCM, Natural Resources Council of Maine, was actually formed to fight this proposal. And they were allied with the timberland owners in that area because they didn't want to lose, several thousand acres of prime timberland in that area. So there was a consensus on what wilderness should be between these people who were intensively using the forest for wood fiber and people who wanted to preserve the recreational access to that same forest under, I guess, what you'd call wilderness conditions. So this idea that they came up with was this working wilderness. And, you see it referred to in the papers as there's no sense of irony to this at all. I mean, nobody caught on that this is an oxymoron, apparently. So it works. It works for Maine. And it has, I guess, since the 1960s in that sense. Yeah.
So I understand now you're working on some books about Thoreau.
Yeah, right.
And is it shifting your analysis, or how do you see it as a...
What really interests me in Thoreau is his perception of landscape as what he called semi-cultivated landscape. I don't think I quite got that term right, but a half-cultivated landscape is what he calls it. And he's perfectly fine with that. He comes up to Maine and he enjoys the Maine wilderness and everything, but he's really happy to get out of there and come back to Concord. So what he's in love with is this same kind of second nature that I'm dealing with here. In fact, that's really how I got started on Thoreau in the first place. So, there's a chapter in that book called A Transcendental Place. And I had thought maybe 2-3 paragraphs on Thoreau in that, ends up being about half that chapter. So I had to do this, because that's really, he's the first spokesman for that kind of a concept, although he doesn't use the term. But yeah, there's a lot of continuity in what. Yeah.
Do you think part of that, this opposition that we see to this plan for a growing park and expanding in size, more Yellowstone-ish in northern Maine, is due to its contradiction to the New England's likeness to this second nature thing that you're talking about? I mean, the idea of it being big and up there in a way where people with money will come from away and use it, and kind of contradictory to the idea of this whole second nature concept.
I think so. I think the idea of what that park should be has evolved quite a bit. But when it was first proposed, by Jim St. Pierre and others, the Restore Maine idea was this would be a wilderness. And I don't think anybody got behind that. I mean, people who lived in Maine know how much that forest has been used over the past 300 years. And the Wilderness Society was behind it too. And I just think that idea would not have attracted much support in Maine. It's since, with Quimby's son, I can't remember his name now, but St. Peter? Yeah, Sinclair. Yeah, I think he's much more accommodating and much more realistic about what that land represents to Maine people than, say, Jim St. Pierre was a few years ago. So, yeah, I think there's sort of a meeting of the minds coming, maybe. Yeah.
I'm not sure how to formulate this question, but one of the things I think is interesting about Maine is that we don't have state forest lands in the sense that you do. Say my first experience was in Wisconsin, and those are very much working lands, but they're also recreation, and and I sometimes wonder if there's so much opposition in Maine because we don't have experience with state forests.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's.
Yeah, our state land acquisitions are really late. I mean, 1987 is when we really got serious about purchasing land, and the State Bureau of Parks actually turned down a lot of bequests of land because they just didn't want to deal with extra land. And the idea behind that was, this sounds kind of short-sighted, and it was. But the idea at the time was that we have rights of access, trespass rights on all non-posted lands, the timberlands in the northern part of the state, which is very different, say, from out west, where lands are all posted. You can't go on it unless you own it, those kinds of things. But we have, going way back into the late 19th century, the right of trespass for recreational purposes on those timberlands. And it was always thought that we don't need state parks because you can go on these lands, you can do anything you want anyway, so why be redundant and, start buying up land? So this was the idea. I kind of lost track of what your question was now. We don't have experience. Right. Yes, we don't have experience with the public use of public lands in the way that you would in Wisconsin or someplace like that. It's funny, the Forest Service was willing to buy up lands, as it did in Wisconsin in the 1930s when, lands were worthless. Timberlands were worthless in the 30s. And that's how you get the national forests in Michigan and Wisconsin, places like that. Plus, they were well cut over. So, there wasn't much else you could do with them at the time. And it says pine forests there are they're sort of single species, so you can come in and you wipe the whole thing out. And then, what are you going to do? You let it go for taxes or sell it to the federal government or something like that. But our forest here was still productive, it's a mixed forest, and the markets are changing so much over time that nobody really wanted to sell it to the federal government. So there were proposals. The National Parks, the Forest Service proposed several times to buy up these lands, and during the 1930s, nobody was selling. The legislature wouldn't allow it, so it just kind of fell through. So it's really fairly late, the last couple of decades, that we're really thinking about public lands.
looks like we've passed the 4 o'clock mark, so why don't we take, but if you want to come up later and ask questions, please do.
Thank you.